set amount. And
I can't see Josh up there, but I hope he's giving me a thumbs up that we're live and on air and everybody can hear me. If not, then you can't hear me. So, I don't know. But we're resuming our study this week in the book of Daniel. You'll remember that the last time we met, which has been a couple of weeks ago, that we talked about the 3 Hebrew young men, among other things. And who can tell me what their names were? I want their Hebrew names. I'm gonna be difficult. Does anybody know?
Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael.
Yes, exactly. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. I mentioned that our youth workers, when I was in high school, one of them emphasized that so that I actually remembered it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is how we commonly know them, right? But we discussed that a couple of weeks ago. We talked about their experience in the furnace. And remind me, what do you remember that, of course, was interesting? Of course, you know, but really important about their absolute trust in God as they're interacting with Nebuchadnezzar. You remember the story. They get called before Nebuchadnezzar. They've been accused of being the only ones not to bow, and they came to Nebuchadnezzar, and he talks to them. And there was something really interesting that they expressed about their trust in God. Do you remember? Yes, Terrell.
Whether we live or die, we are not going to bow before you either.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
God is able to save them.
What's that?
He said God was able to save us, but if not.
Right.
Still not bow.
Yep, they said God is able to save us because Nebuchadnezzar, remember, said, "Who's that God that can deliver you out of my hands?" Right? Kind of like, I'm right here, the furnace is over there, nobody's stopping you from going in that furnace and dying. It's not happening. There's no God on earth that can do that. That's what Nebuchadnezzar said. And Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael said, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, "Look, the God that we serve is able to. And he's going to deliver us out of your hands one way or another, whether it's to go be with him in heaven or whether it's to preserve us through the fire. But, either way, we're not bowing. That's the bottom line. We're not doing it because of their faith in God." So, yeah, that was very interesting. I had no doubt. But their faith in him was not contingent on their deliverance. So they weren't basing, we'll believe him if he takes care of us. If not, we'll know that he's not God. That wasn't their position at all. And so that was the crux of the conversation there in the whole. But if not, they still weren't going to bow. So that was really interesting, really great, of course. And many of you have heard that emphasized before. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. So God was pleased to protect them from harm and deliver them from the furnace. You'll remember that likely at Christophany that Christ himself was with them in the flame and that they weren't touched. The smell of smoke wasn't even on them. There was no evidence that they had been anywhere near fire when they came out. And that, of course, was very amazing. And we also discussed how God humbled Nebuchadnezzar after Nebuchadnezzar, of course, you remember he talked about the dream that he had, about how Daniel came and interpreted that dream of how he was going to be humbled and become essentially as a wild animal if he didn't repent. And for a time, for a space there, perhaps he responded to that message from Daniel, but eventually he's standing in his house one day and he says, "Look at this great Babylon that I created." And it was at that moment that he heard the voice of God, and he was driven from men, became like a wild animal. He was eating grass, his hair grew, his nails grew. Mine are about ready to be trimmed as well. They're not quite as far gone, I don't think, as Nebuchadnezzar's. And so we talked about how God humbled Nebuchadnezzar at that time. And the phrase actually was until he acknowledged the Most High God, that he was the one reigning, the one in control. Now today we're going to look at how Daniel faithfully served God through the reign of several different kings. And so we're going to look at some of that. Although the nation of Judah, of course, is under the control of foreign powers, beginning with Babylon, of course, and it's going to continue on, we'll talk about that as well. God is still working out his purpose and using Daniel, of course, as a part of that. So we're going to jump backwards a little bit from where we were last week. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 2. So go in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to work this activity as well. So if you've got the Daniel's Dream activity in front of you, I'll remind anybody who's, well, whether you're here or whether you're watching online, that the resources for our class are available on our church app. You can get access to the handouts and some of the at-home notes. All those things are available right on the app if you would like to make use of that. You can print them off at home or whatever would help you out that way. So we're going to go back to chapter 2, which is the first time where we see God giving Daniel the ability to interpret dreams. And this is a very interesting, we're going to read it in just a moment, but this is a very interesting situation. Many of you probably remember it and are familiar with it because Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and he wants it interpreted, but he doesn't tell the magicians and the wise men what the dream was. He expects them to figure out what the dream was and interpret it without him giving it to them. And so naturally, none of them were able to do that. None of them were able to tell him what the dream was and then also give the interpretation. And so at that point, the king determines to kill the wise men. Says, hey, if you can't interpret a dream without me giving it to you, then I don't have any confidence in your abilities to begin with. Kind of the Reader's Digest version of that. And so he says, I'd just as well not have any of you around. So he's going to kill them all off. And when the news comes to Daniel that they're going to be killed, including him and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, what's the hurry here? I believe that God can give an answer. Let Nebuchadnezzar know that, and that's what's going to happen. So, let's go to Daniel chapter 2, and we will read through that. And of course, we're outdoors tonight, so my Bible's going everywhere, but let's read through this so we can... there's a couple things. You can see the questions. So as we read through, I want you to keep in mind some of these questions. We're going to ask questions about how Daniel responds and how he gives God the praise for his attributes as he comes to give the interpretation. Whom Daniel's going to attribute the wisdom and understanding to. And then some aspects of the dream. The golden head, the arms and chests of silver, the midsection of bronze. So the various parts, feet of clay, the stone. So I want you to keep those things in mind as we go through. So here's what the Word of God says in Daniel chapter 2. It says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the musicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, the language, of course, they're speaking there. O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show thee the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servant the dream, and we will show him, or show the interpretation of it. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that you would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch the king's captain, Why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house, and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning the secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the vision of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have, more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall break in pieces and bruise, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces, the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth, it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So there's the whole thing laid out. Let's ask a couple of questions about this. Some we've already answered, but we'll ask some others. The first question they have in here, and I think I've got it up on the screen, maybe we'll get there in a moment, is, oh boy, so I put all the text up here, so we'll skip through that. What did Daniel do when he heard about the threat to the wise men? Now, we talked about that, but there was part of it that I didn't tell you. So what was the first thing that Daniel did when he found out the news that the king had commanded to kill all of the wise men? You remember, he called some other people and requested that they would join him in doing something. Did you catch that as we went through? Back towards the beginning of our text. He called for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and asked for them to join with him in praying that the Lord would reveal to them, that he would have mercy on them and reveal to them the dream and the interpretation thereof. So that was his first step, was to call them together. Here we go. To call them together and to ask them to pray with them. And then, when God revealed the mystery to Daniel, the first response that he makes then, of course, is to bless God and to praise God, right? He responds immediately in thanksgiving and in praise to God for revealing that to him. In fact, he particularly praises God for some of his attributes. Did you notice some of the attributes? I think that's the first question that's actually on your handout. Yes, which attributes of God did he praise him for? Did you guys notice that as we came through? If we back up here in chapter 2, and I think verse 20 gives us some of it. Okay, Jarrell?
All powerful and all knowing.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. And he mentions specifically that wisdom belongs to God and that might is his. It mentions in verse 21 that he changeth the times and seasons, talking about his, obviously again, his sovereignty and his power there. He is the one who is, yes, Dr. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah. The blessed be the name of God forever and ever. He starts to introduce the idea of God's eternality.
Absolutely, yes.
Kingdoms come and go.
Mm-hmm.
God does not.
Good. Yeah, God's eternality, which includes his immutability as part of that. The kingdoms come and go, the seasons change, the powers, political and whatever change, but God remains the same. Thank you, absolutely. Talks about his omniscience, that of course that he knows all things, that he is gracious, all of those things. And of course, the next question here is, to whom did Daniel attribute his wisdom and understanding? Obviously, he's attributing all of those to God. He thanks God for giving him wisdom in general and also understanding in the particular area, of course, for which they were making requests. And then don't forget that when he comes and stands before the king, in verse number 28, notice what he says there. I mean, there's no question about this. Daniel doesn't come before God, much like Joseph before him, doesn't come before Nebuchadnezzar and say, hey, you picked the right guy. I got it for you, man. No, he comes and he says, listen, he says, there is a God in heaven. And of course, he attributes both the dream, the revelation of the dream, and the interpretation, of course, to Almighty God. He's very careful to make sure that occurs as he comes before the king there. He says very clearly that it's God who has revealed the mysteries to him. The golden head represented what or whom? What's that?
Babylon.
Babylon, yes, and Nebuchadnezzar particularly. He says, you're the gold head. Well, you can just see Nebuchadnezzar puffing up with pride when he realized, hey, I'm not the feet, I'm the head, not just any head. I am the golden head. So he felt pretty good about that, I'm sure. Now, what about the arms and chest of silver? You know? Okay, the Medes and the Persians. Now, the text doesn't tell us that specifically. It says that there's going to be someone who comes after them. And we know that the Medes and Persians come next. In fact, we'll cover a little bit about that in a little while. And so they're described as silver. And then after that was the arms and chest of silver. We talked about that. Okay. And then the midsection of brass or bronze. Does anybody know what that refers to? Greece. And again, it doesn't tell us specifically this is Greece. But of course, that's the next major world power that comes after the Medo-Persians, under the rule particularly of Alexander the Great. Right, absolutely. And so we have a lot of pretty strong confidence that's who that is referring to. And then the legs of iron, which represents the fourth kingdom.
Rome.
Again, we believe that to be Rome. Yes, the next major world power that comes onto the scene. Now, there's some disagreement about the feet of clay and iron, but in fact, Pastor, who do we normally talk about as the toes of clay and iron?
How about the nations?
Yeah.
The 10 nations? Who is it? The 10 nations?
The toes of the feet and the toes of clay and iron that it talks about in this particular one. That's the one that has a little more disagreement on it, but
the 10 nations that we find in the book of Revelation.
Right.
And by the way, I think in order to understand Revelation, you need to understand Daniel. You can't read Daniel is a commentary on Revelation, vice versa. I mean, it's especially this chapter.
So we're looking to the future on the feet of clay and iron. That's still to come. Now the last one's quite simple. We all know that one. Who's the stone?
God.
We know that's God and Jesus, right? The stone which became a mountain, which represents an everlasting and indestructible kingdom set up by God. It's a stone not cut out with hands, not man-made in any way, but we're talking about God who's going to come and crush the previous kingdoms. And you may remember that this kind of even caused us to look back a little bit to the blessing that Israel gave to Judah when he talked about how the scepter would not depart from Judah, or a lawgiver from between his feet, which of course points to the person of Jesus Christ, who ultimately is that stone that really obliterates all memory of all other great kingdoms, as Jesus, is the king of the ultimate and an everlasting kingdom, as also the descendant of the Davidic line. So it's pretty amazing. So this was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Of course, God gives the interpretation to Daniel. So God blesses Daniel with the ability to interpret dreams, and of course we talked about another dream that he interpreted before. This isn't the only instance where we see that ability on display. And Daniel, as we've already alluded to, of course, realized that his wisdom and his understanding and ability to interpret these dreams came directly from God. And he was not hesitant to emphasize that point to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we're going to talk in just a moment. In fact, I think we're getting there now, so I won't get ahead of myself. We're going to talk a little bit more about some interpreting that he does, and how God gives him the answer there as well. So we're going to go on to Daniel chapter 5, and this is a very interesting, and of course another one that we're perhaps familiar with. Maybe it's not the most familiar of the things in Daniel's life, but another very familiar portion out of the life of Daniel. So let's look at Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded, notice this is important, to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Okay, so let's be clear. He's bringing the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem for them to use to party with, right? This is what he's commanded here. So they bring them. They're taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. The king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. So they're having an immoral, drunken feast here, and they're using articles from, that were deemed holy from the temple to drink from. So they drank wine, and notice, they praised the gods of heaven. No. The gods of gold and silver, brass and iron, of wood and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed. This is an interesting description here. Yeah. His countenance was changed, his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. He was a little disturbed by this whole situation. Can we conclude that? The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, making the same mistake his father made, right? And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever... Don't forget this part either. Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's not much good. We'll find out why in a minute. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever, and let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light, and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read the writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations, and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. They're not going to do any good anyway. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he set up, and whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hath not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. In other words, you knew about all of that, and you chose not to humble your heart. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee. And thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God, oh look at this, and the God in whose hand is thy breath. In whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom, and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. But notice this part here, right? This is the conclusion, verses 30 and 31. In that night was Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. About 62 years old. Pastor, in 2 years you'll be ready to really get going, right?
Yeah, I'm just now starting.
So, interesting stuff. So, what was Belshazzar doing right before the hand appeared?
Yeah!
Right.
Drunk as heck.
So, we already talked about it, right? He's having a party. He's brought in. I mean, again, the interesting thing here is that the text tells us, Daniel mentions specifically, he said, look, you knew about what happened to your father. You were around. You remember probably, he remembered that his father went from men and became essentially an animal for a while, lived outside, ate grass, and just went nuts for a period of time, several years, 7 years was it, if I remember right, something like that. You knew that. You knew why it happened. You knew what brought about the eventual return of his senses when he acknowledged God. And yet, rather than choosing to learn from your father's errors and repentance, not only have you been lifted up in pride, but you brought the very vessels out of God's house, and you used those vessels to give toast to all the gods under the sun, except the one who is holding the breath that is in your lungs right now. You know? And it's you almost wonder, if he had added God in with the rest of them, would he maybe have survived? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. But to think about the fact that out of all of that, you know, he praised every false god imaginable and left out the one that was actually in control of everything that's going on. So pretty interesting. He's hosting a feast. And how did Belshazzar respond when he saw the hand and the writing on the wall? Dr. Brandick.
He wet himself. He was very disturbed.
Yes.
He lost control of everything.
It wasn't a good time for him.
No.
He was very very disturbed by all that. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, he immediately calls in the wise men, and they can't tell him anything. They probably wouldn't have wanted to if they could. And we find a similarity between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. I kind of made an allusion to it, but Nebuchadnezzar, both times when he had a dream, he calls for the wise men, the soothsayers, the Chaldeans, all of them, and they weren't able to answer either of his dreams. And then when Belshazzar has this writing on the wall, it does the same thing, calls for the wise men, the soothsayers, and they can't tell him anything. And so then the queen comes in, Belshazzar's mother, and says, hey, back in your father's day, this man Daniel could deal with these things. And so he brings in Daniel, and he addresses him, you know, in a pagan sense, saying, hey, we understand that, you know, you've got the spirit of the gods in you and those sorts of things. Not acknowledging or recognizing, of course, that his wisdom and his abilities came from God. And how did Daniel respond? Now, I like this when you read when Daniel comes and responds to Belshazzar. Belshazzar says, "Hey, you know, I understand you're the smartest guy around, and the gods have really blessed you and whatever. And hey, if you can interpret my dream, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. What does Daniel say? All right, Joe, go ahead.
If I can paraphrase it without causing error to this, I would say he says, keep the change, you filthy animal. He doesn't want what Belshazzar is offering him.
Okay, so he says, keep your gifts, I don't need it. It's not going to do me good anyway, because you've got a few hours left of life here, and your kingdom's over, right? So yeah, he says, keep that, but I'll interpret the dream for you. And then he kind of goes and gives him a lecture, right? That's what we just talked about. He tells him all that we talked about, right? He says, hey, you knew all of this. This is what happened with your father. You ignored it. You're done, essentially. Tells him what the dream means. There's an attribute of God, of course, that is kind of brought into mind in verse 23, which is, God's jealousy. We talked about them praising all of the other gods and leaving God out. Belshazzar had set himself and his gods higher than the true God. The words on the wall we read, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, and they meant that God had taken numbered the days of the kingdom. You can almost think of it as an accounting of his days and his time, and you're done. This is it. We're cutting it off here. The word Tekel, which meant that he had been measured or weighed and found wanting. He didn't come up to the mark, so to speak. And then the last word, Upharsin or Perez, as the plural form, indicates that his kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So, of course, the message is that it's over, you're done, you have failed to acknowledge God, and you're being cut off at this point. Yes, Dr. Brandon.
Okay. Also, an interesting thing is that word Perez, which is the singular of Upharsin. That's a word play on Persian. So the being in Aramaic, everyone would have known what these words were. They were looking for the meaning of them. Daniel's like, oh yeah, it's a letter from home, I can read every word. They want to know what the meaning was.
Right.
And even within that, where he is going to divide it, just the particular word he used rolls right into the Persians. So they were probably getting the picture as Daniel was speaking.
Wow. Yes, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, so, yeah, and it's funny because, of course, the part concludes with him getting the chain of gold and, so, okay, appreciate that. Here's your chain. Yeah, see you later.
And you're dead.
You almost wonder what happened after that. Because here he's delivered the message from God that you're done, your life is over, the Medes are coming. Maybe, I don't know if Daniel told him, hey, this is happening tonight, or if Belshazzar knew it was happening tonight. But it is kind of interesting how it just concludes. He puts a chain on his, change the garments or whatever, and kind of sends him on his way. And that is that. Belshazzar's pride is apparently still intact, at least it appears so. He rewards Daniel with, of course, what are going to be meaningless rewards. And then that very night, he is killed when the Medo-Persian army captures Babylon. And then Darius the Mede is set over the kingdom. Now we're going to go, Rich is going to come and take the next part of the lesson as God protects Daniel. We get the part that we all are so familiar with, but the good stuff there too with the lion's den. So Darius the Mede has just come in, and then you're going to pick up the next section.
It's always amazing how quickly people forget what God has done so rapidly. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, he knew it, he knew what had happened, but it's like how quickly we all forget what God has done. And the great things we've seen happen, and then we'll turn around, and I think it's a pride issue most of the time. It's a pride issue that maybe we kind of delude ourselves into believing that it wasn't actually God, or we deserved what God had done, and so we're not going to give him the credit. So we see Nebuchadnezzar coming to an end. We get into Daniel chapter 6, and we had talked before about the persecution that Daniel's friends had faced. Why did they face persecution? What was the main reason? What's that? What's that?
They feel the bottom.
Right. They wanted to honor God, and so that was basically their great sin, so to speak, that caused them to have persecution. When we come into Daniel chapter 6, we're going to see it's really a setup, for lack of a better term. They don't like Daniel. They don't like the position he's in. So I'll read through chapter 6, and starting at verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All these presidents of the king and the governor and the princes and the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of these, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open, in his chamber towards Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled, and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, that they came near and spoke before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree, and every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, This thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but make his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, King, know, O king, the law of the Medes and the Persians is, that no decree nor statute with the king established may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel, and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lord, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning, and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver these from lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel, and has shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree, that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, whom hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we have a fascinating turn of events. We see a setup. They lied about him. They set him up. The thing that always strikes me about this is, it always makes me think, it says that after he was accused, what did Darius do from the point where he realized he had to condemn Daniel to death until that night? What does it say he did? We covered that a little bit, but what does it say he did? He was fasting, he was working. Why? To try to figure out a way to deliver Daniel. This is amazing. The king is troubled. He's vexed. He can't eat. And then it says he can't sleep that night. What kind of an impact did Daniel have on this king in a very relatively short amount of time? This is kind of an amazing thing. And so now we read that who is the king in this account? As we had said, it's Darius the Mede, whose reigning was 62-year-old at the time that he took over Babylon. Now, the places these events occur, the time frame is 538 BC. Do you guys know how old Daniel was at this point?
Well, in his 80s.
In his 80s. And oftentimes I think it's represented maybe to the kids it shows a young man standing before this, but this is a person in his 80s is thrown into a lion's den. Now how this lion's den was structured, I don't know if it was a zoo where they fed the lions or they just strictly used these lions to feed people that had gone against the king. I'm not really sure, but and so we have a man in his 80s. Now, why did the other governors set a plot against Daniel? Why did they dislike him?
The king liked him more. It was strictly about that the king favored him.
Right, the king favored him, and then it said what? They tried to find something against Daniel to accuse him. And so, what did that do? That made him even more mad. Why? Because they were probably corrupt in themselves, looking at this man saying, not only does the king like him, we can't even find anything wrong with him. Go ahead.
Yeah, so they couldn't manipulate him or
Right.
blackmail him or get him to do their bidding because they didn't have any dirt on him.
Right. They had no power over him. They
Right.
couldn't manipulate him.
Yeah, and we have to remember that everything that Darius had, he had basically inherited from the previous kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
As a wise ruler, he was using people that knew the kingdom. So there's
right.
a huge political power play going on
Right.
in the Persian Empire right now.
Right.
After trying to shuffle others out and rise to power themselves.
Right. Much like what happens after we have a presidential election where we switch parties. I mean, a lot of the faces don't actually change in specific positions of power. They just shuffle themselves around to try to get more positions of power. And so you see that here. And so we see Daniel being moved up because of his faithfulness, because of God was obviously blessing him. He had a clear impact on the king. Now, another issue that they might have found with him was simply his Jewish faith. These were a God-hating people. Now, did the men go before the king, or when they went before the king to try to basically trap Daniel, did they speak truthfully? Were they honest in how they handled themselves? No, they did not speak truthfully. They said that all of the governors of the kingdom had agreed to this decree. Had Daniel agreed to this decree?
Obviously
No.
not.
Obviously not. They had made this decree to try to trap Daniel, so they probably left him out of that little secret meeting. How did Daniel respond to the decree? Did Daniel understand the decree? Yes. How did he respond?
He said, I'm still going to worship God.
He shrugged the decree off. Did he know it was the entire decree was set to trap him? We don't know. He probably was not a stupid man. He understood the politics and the power struggle that was happening. And so he very well probably knew this might be a setup. But he didn't care. Much like the men before him, or the time before him, whether God was going to deliver him from this through keeping him alive and keeping his position, or God was going to deliver him by allowing him to die and be with him in heaven, Daniel didn't much care. So we see the same. Now, so Daniel's response was he continued to praise God, lift up his prayers before God. How did the king find out about this? Exactly. And, we've got him now. You know, we're gonna go talk. Right. Exactly. Kind of like I was gonna say the people that turn in restaurants. Right. The people that turn in restaurants for having too many guests. Kind of. You know, well, I'm gonna go tell. It's like, so now, so the king, as we had mentioned, was displeased with himself. Why couldn't the king just reverse the decree that he had done, Terrell?
The laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed.
Exactly.
No matter he could write a new decree, but that still couldn't change the one he had already made.
Right. And it wasn't like we have in the United States where we have hundreds of laws that we just ignore. It had to be, especially since the king was challenged so openly by all the governors. It was brought before the king. There's no way he could shrug it off and say, I don't really think that's what it meant. And so the king was displeased. Now, he couldn't reverse his decree. Now, what did Darius say to Daniel as he's being thrown into the lion's den? So there was clearly a point at which the king didn't really care that all of these other governors saw him. And he tells Daniel as he's being thrown into the lion's den, what does he tell him? Yeah, I mean, he's reassuring Daniel, but I think in a lot of respects, King Darius was reassuring himself. God is going to deliver you, right? Like, God's got you on this one. Like, I screwed up. I can't fix this. I'm sorry. I've spent all day and all night fasting and working, but God's going to deliver you from this. And so you almost kind of have a little bit of a heart for Darius. You almost kind of look at Darius and you're like, you know, this guy must not have been a horrible human being if his heart was set towards Daniel in this. And then, so he's thrown into the lion's den. And then it says, what did they do to the lion's den after they threw Daniel in? They sealed it shut, wax ring, we're not really sure. But then it's sealed also with a stamp or a signet, like they would do on a letter, you know, with the gel or the wax, to ensure that nobody was going to go in there and mess with this. So the king was not able to sleep. You know, we see that this tomb was sealed. Nobody could, you know, no funny business. I don't know if the king meant this to be able to prove 100% that his king is going to, you know, maybe this was a common practice. I don't know. So Darius is worried. He's hopeful that, you know, God is going to preserve Daniel. Now, how did God preserve Daniel? What does the Bible say? What's that? Sent his angels to shut the mouths of the lion. If I was Daniel, I'd be worried about the mouth, but those things have claws. Like, I mean, we have a cat. If that cat really lays into you, it's like, its claws hurt. And that's a tiny cat. But it says that their mouths were shut in reference to the fact that they weren't hungry, I think was the point. You know, they looked at Daniel and their mouths are shut, they're held at bay. It probably was at first scary, but I mean, that would have been a pretty amazing miracle for Daniel to see. He's in a lion's den. There's lions that are hungry, and they're not eating him. I mean, what an amazing thing to be able to witness. I've never been face to face with an animal that wanted to eat me, when I didn't have a firearm to protect myself. You know, I had a bear that I shot 25 feet from me when I first saw it because it was 11 o'clock at night, and I felt pretty comforted having that 308. Daniel's in a den. He has nowhere to go. I mean, this is just little things like that always kind of, you know, excite me. They make me realize how amazing these stories were. Now, so does God always save his children from plots like these? No, he doesn't. As Pastor had mentioned this morning, you know, sometimes you're saved from the plot and sometimes you're not. Does that make God ever any less sovereign? No. God's purpose and everything that God does glorifies him. In this case, what do we see after this happens? God is glorified by King Darius. Another decree is set about it. What else happens after Daniel is removed from the lion's den? And, you know, who had that job? Okay, now we got to reopen that, and we got to get him out of there with a bunch of hungry lions, you know. What happens after this? What does Darius do?
He throws the rulers and the whole family.
Right.
And they were killed before they ever reached the bottom.
Yeah, right. Those lions were hungry at this point. I don't know how many lions are in a lion's den. You know, obviously these are somewhat of a captivity type of a thing.
Doesn't take many.
What's that?
Doesn't take many.
It doesn't take many. Right. I can imagine one lion.
Well, it says we've got wives, plural, and children,
Right.
and that they didn't reach the bottom.
Right.
So we've got enough lions to take care of several,
Right.
decent group of people here.
Now, was the king justified in doing what he did?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was a plot against Daniel, the plot failed, and the king said, these men lied, these men plotted, there's no room for that, now they're all dead. And so, you know, we just see how God is working here. So, just as God had been pleased to save Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, really from an ungodly decree from Nebuchadnezzar, God was also pleased to save Daniel from the ungodly decree of Darius. Whether Darius was forced to or not doesn't really matter. It was an ungodly decree. Now, these kings had exalted themselves to the place of God by their decrees. Darius, yes, had been tricked, but Darius's decree set himself up above God. Maybe that was part of why he was so afraid. He was tricked into this, didn't have his guard up, his radar on, and ultimately, I think he was afraid of Daniel's God as much as anybody was. And so God clearly demonstrated that he's more powerful than these kings. He's also more powerful than the plotting of these governors, the lions, or of the fire that we had seen prior to this. Now, how does this chapter end? What is Darius doing at the end of this chapter? At the very end of the chapter, what is Darius doing? Or not quite the very end. What is Darius? He is decreeing that God is the Most High God. He sets out a decree. He sets out, there's no question in anybody's mind. Everybody else that now saw this power grab, because now all of a sudden all these princes and these governors are out. Other people want to take their place. As they're walking into that position, they're going, Darius is decreeing that this God is the God of God, the Lord of Lords, and has power over everything. I mean, this had to send some shockwaves into Babylon at this point. And this established for a very long time, well, I guess quite a long time from this point on, who God is and what God can do. And so it's just an amazing story. Now, real quick, do we have another minute or two? we have another minute. We look at these Bible verses. How does these Bible verses and this story about a king and governors and princes and God being glorified, how does that translate to us today? How can we apply it to our lives? Or is this another old Bible story that's just a fun story to read? I mean, the Bible is translatable no matter what generation you're in. So how do we translate this to us? One thing I think of in the first place is we get worked up, and I get worked up over who's president, who's controlling Congress. Now, I want who I believe should be controlling Congress and sitting in the White House. But ultimately, at the end of that, who's really in control? God is. Darius could die the day after, and God is still in control. I'm not even going to say his name. Could get in. Of course, he doesn't remember his own name right now, but could get in next time. That's kind of bad. But God is still in control. How else does this apply to us today? Caleb?
Well, I think you can't overlook the fact that obviously this was something that Daniel was doing all along. Like,
Right.
He didn't start, praying out his window when it started becoming, there's a law against it.
Exactly.
He had done it all along.
Right. Knowing full well, and this is the application, God will deliver you in one form or another from everything that comes about. So if you're faithfully serving Him, and I think that's where people, they get into trouble, and then they want to start serving God, and then they want to start praying, and then they want to start fasting. And Daniel was faithful to God long before this hit. Daniel knew at any moment these governors hated him. Darius loved him. It was inevitable that somebody was going to try something. But God's always faithful. Anyone think anything else before I close in prayer? No? All right. I think we're being booted. There's people lining up. I'll close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for your word, that we can look back at these writings that are still so meaningful to us today, and we can see that you deliver, you're faithful, you're all-knowing, and then you have the power to overcome any situation we're in. I doubt today any of us will be thrown into a lion's den, but we still face things that seem insurmountable. And I thank you and praise you that you give us the opportunity to humbly come before you and seek your guidance, seek your counsel. We have your word that we can draw off of, and that we can have the faith like Daniel did, and we can have the understanding to know that you have the ability to overcome. We ask this in your name. Amen.